I'm an emergency physician. I live in Yellowknife in Canada's Northwest Territories. I spend about half of my time in the emerge and about half of my time working on the world's biggest health emergency, climate change. It's easy to stay motivated. We're kind of melting in Yellowknife. Every summer we get new dips in the roads as the permafrost kind of melts down, and then you hit them on your way to the hospital and you're like, whoa. It does wake you up, which is good. I came north as a newly minted emerge doc. And I hadn't thought about climate change or the environment since I was in about grade 5. And then one day I was in the Edmonton airport and I picked up a book and I was like, okay, well I should learn something about this. Read it as we went through Yellowknife and up to Inuvik, and by the time I got to Inuvik I was like, oh my gosh, this thing's badness. So, like any good emergency physician, I consulted Dr. Google. And it turned out that 6 months earlier, The Lancet, the world's most prestigious medical journal, had called climate change the biggest global health threat of the 21st century. I was like, I just finished emergency school. They missed that. How do you miss the biggest problem? Anyhow, I started asking around Inuvik, and it turns out it's already 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it was at baseline in the 1950s, just according to the temperature gauge records from the airport. Now, 3 degrees Celsius is a big deal when you're talking about the difference between solid water and liquid water. I took this picture on a flight between Inuvik and a little nursing station in Aklavik. This is the Mackenzie River. When it freezes, it becomes a highway for people. It's how they cheaply transport groceries and building supplies. It's how they visit their friends and family. It's also a road for the caribou, which is a traditional food and very significant protein source for the Aboriginal communities who live here. So you can imagine when the ice gets more sketchy, it makes for decreased safety of ice-based travel, dropping caribou herds, less successful hunts, and less food for people to share with their families. The rapid landscape change also can lead to a feeling called solastalgia, which means feeling homesick when you're still at home. So those are a little bit of how climate change is impacting health where I live. How's it impacting health in the rest of the world? This slide was drawn from a 2012 McMichael et al. Report in the British Medical Journal. It has a little bit of Watt's 2015 and 2017 from The Lancet and a tiny bit of Sam Myers thrown in. So climate change is going to lead to immediate and direct risks to health, indirect risks, and risks associated with climate conflict and environmental refugee flows. The immediate risks, those are the things we see on the news right now. So heat waves make it tough to cope and to work, can lead to heat stress, heat stroke, deaths. Drought decreases access to water, can make wildfires more likely, which have been horrible in Canada and the US in the last few years, leading to burns, deaths, evacuations, sending big clouds of smoke up that can travel for hundreds of kilometers and lead to asthma exacerbations and breathing problems. Now, we've seen storms down in Puerto Rico and Florida that can lead to injuries, death, pollute water sources, and any of these tragedies can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety. Now, we haven't even talked about the critters that can bite us and make us itchy and make us sick and sometimes kill us. Vector-borne disease is changing. Lyme disease is moving across Canada, and dengue fever is increasing worldwide. Now, more intense pollen seasons make it tough for people with allergies, and increasing temperatures result in increased conversion of ground-level ozone into air pollution that makes it tough for us, and we can get cancer from that, heart disease, stroke, lower respiratory disease. Now, much of this is being driven by increasing CO2 levels, mostly from the burning of fossil fuels. And as CO2 goes up in the air, it actually also seeps into water bodies underneath. And when it's in the water, it acts like an acid. So that's no good for the fish. And it's also no good for the people who rely on fish for protein, and that's about 1 billion people worldwide. Now, all the weird weather does weird things to crop yields, and undernutrition is actually expected to be the major health consequence of climate change in the 21st century. It's already associated with almost half of pediatric deaths worldwide. Now, the impact of malnutrition was made very real to me when I spent 6 months working on a pediatric malnutrition project with Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, in the Horn of Africa, in a slum in a tent ICU. Before going, I had never had a child die under my care. The first time it happened, I wanted to disappear through the crust of the earth. Could I have been faster? Could I have done something differently? I swore in front of all my staff in English, and I hope they didn't understand. And then I got back to work because I still had 50 other kids to see. The most humbling thing was that almost every time the mom, after the child died, would come and take my hand, and she would say, "Thank you. Thank you for caring for my child." Can you imagine having a mother thank you after their child has just died under your care? During one of those moments, I had a white-hot, full-body wave of rage that children die of malnutrition at all, and I said to myself that when I got back to Canada, I would do everything I could to prevent further similar deaths, and it turns out that means working on climate change. So you can imagine, if your kid didn't have any food, you'd go almost anywhere to find them food, so that means you might leave your home, go to someone else's home, and they might not like it that you came. Population displacement can lead to conflict. This is one of the problems that we're worried about as we get warmer. So there's information and studies coming out of Syria already that show that a 5-year-long climate-related drought and famine led to population displacement, which meant that when the spark of the Arab Spring arrived, there was already an unstable population. Just one factor contributing to the conflict. Now, the thought has been that to avoid the worst health impacts of climate change, we need to keep global surface temperature warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, aiming for 1.5. Unfortunately, our emissions trajectory currently has us heading to between 2.6 to 4.8 degrees Celsius. Now, because of these kinds of factors, those temperatures are expected to lead to badness, increased sea level rise, stress, displacement, potentially culminating in systemic and economic collapse. You guys are so glad you came here today. So, 4 degrees Celsius is not considered consistent with global organized civilization. Now, in effect, this is a difficult diagnosis for all of us. When you think about if somebody gets a diagnosis of cancer, when I'm in the emerge and I see something in a chest x-ray and I have to say, "Hey, I saw something worrisome, we need to come up with a treatment plan," nobody likes to hear that. It doesn't make them happy. Some people have lots of questions. They want to know everything. Some people get really quiet. Some people kind of want to avoid the issue. We all have different reactions. And what I think is important is that we start to develop insight into our emotional reactions to the diagnosis of climate change, because then we can work on becoming as centered as we can, and that's going to help our judgment and our action going forwards. I've been here. I have been there around my 6-month-old. Now, it's important to remember that it could be worse, right? You could have a raging urinary tract infection, a horrible dental pain. It's important every day to try to do things that are helpful to you, whether that's spending time with friends and family, time outside, time without your phone. You may need to access mental health services to get you out of that really stressed out place. But what I'd like people to know is that it's possible. And the most interesting thing to me has been that action feels better than anxiety. I don't worry anymore, I just do the work. So we're at a point of transition. What is the best case treatment scenario for us right now? We're pretty lucky because we've come up with a lot of the technology we need at the right prices right at the right time, because renewables are dropping in price. We're often told to do things like change our light bulbs, hang to dry, avoid too much plane travel, but basically that's not enough. We need to change the system. So it's just easier and cheaper to live in a low carbon way than a high carbon way. My friend Nick Watts was producing a giant climate change and health report for The Lancet with a multidisciplinary team of doctors, engineers, ecologists, economists, financial planners, urban planners. And when they looked at it all, it turns out that they concluded that achieving a decarbonized global economy and securing the public health benefits that it offers is no longer primarily a technical or an economic question. It's just a matter of getting it done. So, what do we do? What I learned in Djibouti is that if you work quickly, if you do the right thing quickly in a timely way, sometimes you can pull someone out of a near-death spiral and come in the next day, and instead of having a little person kind of all one in their mom's arms, you've got a little sprite sitting up and reaching for your stethoscope. What if planets are the same way? What if we step up as a generation and we're able to say to our kids, look, we moved, we pulled this thing out of the spiral. It's not perfect, but we can cope with what we've got. Now, who leads? This is a slide of who people trust. Now, if you'll notice, the politicians are at the very bottom. So how about you not leave the whole saving the world thing all up to them? Nurses are at the top. That is very promising. Yeah. Doctors are second. You may notice hairdressers do pretty well. In fact, man and woman on the street do well, way better than ministers. So we all have pull, and we need to use it. I decided to start with the doctors. I wanted Canadian physicians to send a really clear message that climate change is an urgent health threat and that a low-carbon transition is needed as treatment. It took us 5 years, but the Northwest Territories Medical Association and I got the Canadian Medical Association to divest from fossil fuels and invest in renewable energy. This transition is happening. The 2017 Lancet Countdown report showed that in 2016, there are more people employed in renewable energy worldwide than there are in fossil fuel extraction. And Canadian physicians think it's really important that we anticipate where we're going, see whose livelihoods are going to be impacted, and proactively retrain and help them resettle so that this is a just transition. Now, this is happening worldwide to the point that a new discipline is emerging called planetary health. And we're looking for places where we can have a big impact on both the health of people and the planet. One of the biggest places is in supporting women to have education and access to family planning that they tell us that they want. It turns out that this reduces their vulnerability to natural disasters, improves the yields on their farms, reducing potential for malnutrition, and makes for smaller and healthier families. And in addition to all of that goodness, it also is one of the cheapest ways of decreasing carbon emissions, because a smaller family for humanity means less carbon emitters and less carbon emissions. Now, I've had 25 years of education and 20 years on contraceptives, and I have no clue what my life would be like without that. Incredibly, though, given all of this goodness, there's still a giant funding gap. We need to fund this. Another place where we can really improve health by climate action is in improving healthy energy. So these are the top 5 ways you could die in Canada of chronic disease. There's another way also that's in the top 5, it's accidents. Stats in the US are very similar. So how do we decrease these and improve health for the climate? The biggest target is to make a whole bunch of healthy energy and phase out coal. Coal is responsible for 44% of global CO2 emissions and almost 1 million air pollution-related deaths every single year. One of the best case studies is here in Canada. In Ontario, a group of health professionals convinced the Ontario government to phase out coal, and we've seen a 30 megaton per year reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and hundreds less deaths, or hundreds less emergency visits for respiratory-related disease. So we make clean energy. The additional benefit is we don't have to extract coal and we don't have to frack for natural gas, both of which put our water resources at risk. We can't afford to screw up our water and our climate at the same time. So that's the first step in decreasing our emissions enough to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. The other 2 things we really need to think about in the next couple decades are maximizing energy efficiency and electrifying end uses like heating and transport. So in this low-carbon world, we'll be getting around in electric cars and trains and vehicles, and also on our own 2 feet, because it turns out that commuting on foot or by bike actually reduces your chances of dying of heart disease, as well as exercise decreases anxiety and depression and greenhouse gas emissions, and all of the prices associated with dealing with all of those hospital visits for the chronic diseases. So this is a huge opportunity. Cycling additionally reduces all-cause mortality, as well as our chance of dying from cancer. Now, if we fuel these commutes with a plant-rich, low-carbon diet, we'll be even healthier. This reduces cardiovascular disease risk, your risk of getting colorectal cancer and diabetes, as well as having a 20 to 30% reduction in your footprint associated with carbon emissions, land use, and water. This is huge. We need to make sure that we welcome our newcomers, because we will have refugees coming to our shores, and we need to be good at treating them well. So these win-wins for health and the planet are why the Lancet says that tackling climate change is the biggest health opportunity of our time, of the 20th century. I don't know about you, but I like working where the opportunities are. Working on this, I've met so many cool people who have taught me so many amazing things. You'd be amazed what can be accomplished at a potluck or recurring teleconferences. Now, I am lucky to live in a majority of Aboriginal territory, and it's shown me what's possible when an entire culture takes planetary health into account. When my daughter brought home her first report card last year, the categories were communication skills, literacy, numeracy, connection to the land. If kindergarten can start to take planetary health into account, I'm sure the rest of us can too. Now, I still love being an emergency doctor. Every once in a while, I get a chance to save a life. Working on planetary health, though, we all have a chance to help the Earth save us. Thank you. Aww. Thanks. Thanks, guys.